In life, there are three questions that are incredibly important to ask, and yet they're often very underrated because sometimes the answers are very simple. Where am I? Where am I going? And how do I get there? Sometimes this is real easy. I'm at Holy Cross. When church is over, I will go to Smith's. And I will get there by pulling out of the parking lot, turning left, going down first, and then turning into Smith's. That's a real easy way to answer that question. You might have similar plans. I know I usually run into several of you at the grocery store after church on Sunday. Or you might be going to lunch. Or you could just be going home for lunch. But I imagine you have a pretty good plan for where you are right now, where you will be going, and how you will be getting there. Now sometimes, though, this gets a little bit more complicated. If I don't know exactly where I'm going, it's handy to have an address. If I don't know how to get to that address, it's really handy to have something like Google Maps where you just have it tell you how to get there. But then when you start talking about more abstract things in life, these things get quite a bit more difficult. When I was just getting done with college, I didn't really know where I was. I had even less of an idea of where I was going and absolutely no idea of how to get there. You have to know all of these things to kind of develop what things are going to do for you. Whether it's as simple as going to the grocery store or as complicated as what am I doing with my life? You need to know the answers to these three questions, or at least have a general idea. Today's reading from Acts looks at the Apostle Paul, who very confusingly in the middle of our reading got his name changed from Saul to Paul. And it just kind of happens all of a sudden. It's in the section that we skipped, but it says, and Saul, who is called Paul, yada, 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 and he's Paul from there on out. And you're like, okay, I guess his name's Paul now. Paul had just experienced a big change in the answers to these questions for him. Because up until chapter 8-ish, I think, of Acts, Paul had a very specific plan. He knew where he was. He was a very passionate person, passionate for God. He knew where he was going. He was going to persecute these Christians who he considered heretics. And he knew how he was going to get there because he got some paperwork from the religious authorities and was going to Damascus to do exactly that, to persecute some Christians. But along the road, Paul had a very interesting experience. He met Jesus. And he was struck blind and ended up having to go to the house of a man named Ananias to get healed. And after he was healed, he started preaching to anyone who would listen about the Jesus who he met on the road to Damascus. After that experience, he started to have a new identity, and he started to have new answers to these questions. He had a new where he was, because he was now, instead of persecuting Christians, he was a Christian. He had a new where he was going. He wanted to tell everyone he met about Jesus, and he had a how to get there by literally telling everyone he met about Jesus. But in today's lesson from Acts, he gets a lot more specific direction in that regard when God says to this group of believers, send Barnabas and Saul, Paul, out to do the work that they have to do. He gets a new where he's going. So he goes everywhere. And I'm not really exaggerating all that much. He kind of goes everywhere. He starts out by leaving Antioch, which is around Syria. He goes to the port city of Seleucia, then to the island of Cyprus. He crosses the island of Cyprus, leaves the other side of Cyprus to go to Turkey, and then ends up in this town in central Turkey called Lystra. He was just going everywhere to talk about Jesus. And that's what he keeps doing for basically the rest of the book of Acts. He goes everywhere. all the while making sure that the name of Jesus is known. Where is he? He's a follower of Jesus. Where is he going? Everywhere. How's he getting there? Whatever way proclaims the good news of Jesus. Matthew's gospel is a little bit similar. Jesus calls his disciples together and sends them out. Sends them out into the villages and the towns around where they were to preach the good news, to heal people if people need healing, drive out any evil spirits that need driving out, and to preach the good news. Unfortunately for us today, we usually don't get that clear of a message as Paul or Jesus' disciples get. When we seek these answers for ourselves or for our families or for our church, it can be difficult to figure out the answers because we don't have a very physical Jesus standing there telling us where we're going. And we usually get stuck somewhere. Now, it's usually not too hard to figure out where we are. We usually get a pretty good idea of that. We know that part of the answers. But sometimes we trick ourselves, don't we? We trick ourselves into thinking that where we are is worse than what it actually is, or that where we are is better than it actually is. But before we figure out where we're going, it's important to know where we are. What is going on? Who are we? Because once we know that, we can start to figure out where we're going. But we can't figure out where we're going until we know where we are. Just like GPS isn't much help if it thinks you're halfway across town when you're really on this side of town. Which mine does that sometimes. It gets very confused and it thinks that I'm over by the airport. And I don't understand why. Just sometimes my phone gets confused and it decides that I'm by the airport when I'm sitting in my house. My house is vaguely near the airport, but not like that close to the airport. But we get the same way about our own lives. We sometimes do the equivalent of thinking that we're at the airport when we're not. So that's the first thing we need to figure out. Where are we? And then the hard one. Where are we going? Once we have an honest picture of where we are, we can start to find a mission or a vision or a purpose or whatever you want to call it. But it's, where is God calling us? Where is God calling us as an individual? Where is God calling our family? Where is God calling our church? Because that's the next step. Once we know where we are, where are we going? That process takes a lot of prayer and reflection. It's spending time in conversation with God, listening to what He has to say, because He's the one with the best answers. He'll tell us where we are. He'll tell us where we're going. But it takes us listening. And then, of course, the even harder part, if you've got where we are and you've got where we're going, how do we get there? How do we get from where we are to where we're going? And it's the same challenging process of listening to God, but it's such an important thing for us to do on every level. Because if we don't have knowledge of these three things, if we don't know where we are, where we're going, and how we're going to get there, well, then we're just kind of lost. I remember back before GPS was a thing, if you ever had to go somewhere new, oh my goodness, that was complicated. You could end up on a street and have no idea where you are or where you're going, how you got there, and get lost somewhere in the deep, dark depths of Draper. At least that's what happened to me several times when I was driving before the age of GPS. Draper can be a scary place. Not anymore, it's very suburban now, but it used to have cows and smells. so many smells. But it can be real easy if we don't have that plan to get ourselves lost. We get lost thinking that we're going somewhere, but end up going in the wrong direction if we don't know how we're getting where we're going. If we know where we're going, but we don't know where we are, then you don't know what your first turn is going to be. And if you've ever just driven without knowing where you're going, you can get lost real fast. If you just start doing stuff frantically to try to figure out where you're going and get there, but not actually know where your destination really is. Our readings today are examples of God showing people who they are, where they're going, and how they're getting there. And I know that God does the same thing for us. But it means we have to listen. It means we have to take time with Him to find that path. Because if we don't, then we're just lost. We're no longer following Jesus if we're not going where He's leading us. We're no longer following Jesus if we're not listening to Him tell us where we are. But if we do listen, if we do seek Him out, we can trust that God will answer us. Just like He answered Paul, just like He answered the disciples. And He will meet us where we are, show us where we're going, and walk with us as we get there. Because that's what He said He'll do. A couple weeks ago when we read the Great Commission and Jesus said, go and make disciples of all nations, He also said, I'm never going to leave you. And that's a promise that we have. That He will show us where we are, where we're going, and how we'll get there. But we need to listen. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes we may not at first like where we're going. I didn't really like that God was wanting me to be a pastor, but here I am. And it's good. So we need to trust God. Trust His leading, trust His guiding, because He will lead us. He will take us from where we are, bring us to where we're going, and walk with us the whole time. Why? Because He promised, and His promises are true.